Good evening and welcome to the Quarantine Book Club's discussion of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. My name is Pamela Scholzvik, and tonight's live event is hosted by Amy and Nancy Harrington, sisters
Streaming live. All right, yep, I see it.
Who founded the Passionistas Project to inspire women to follow their passions. Their podcast, the Passionistas Project Podcast, features interviews with a diverse group of women, from celebrity chef Susan Feniger to artist Lynn Evola, who melts down nuclear weapons to make peaceful angel sculptures. They have a quarterly subscription box called the Passionistas Project Pack, filled with products from women-owned businesses and female artisans. And they host their own Facebook Live events in the Passionistas Project Facebook group. You can follow them there and go to their website, thepassionistasproject.com, to learn more. So Grady Hendricks is a New York Times best-selling author who has written about the Confederate flag for Playboy magazine, covered machine gun collector conventions, and scripted award shows for Chinese television. His novels include Horror Store, about a haunted IKEA, My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is basically Beaches meets The Exorcist, We Sold Our Souls, a heavy metal horror epic, and the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. He's also the author of Paperbacks from Hell, an award-winning history of the horror paperback boom of the 70s and 80s. He wrote the screenplay for Mohawk, a horror flick about the War of 1812, and Satanic Panic, about a pizza delivery woman fighting rich Satanists. You can discover more ridiculous facts about him at www.gradyhendricks.com. Welcome, Grady, to the Quarantine Book Club. It's very exciting to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Laura from the library.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
I won't reveal that because it's top secret information.
That's true.
And then Susan, my co-admin in the book club. And I'm just going to start off with a very basic question because I have read 3 of your books. We Sold Our Souls, and I have read My Best Friend's Exorcism, and then of course your latest book. So I want to know, what scares you?
You're going to hate this answer, but honestly, being broke scares me.
Can relate.
You know, I love horror. Like, it's where I've been not my entire life, but like it's something I love. I find it really comforting and enjoyable. And like, you know, like zombies, if I had to pick one thing that scares me in horror, it'd be, you know, the thought of an actual zombie apocalypse. But, you know, for me, honestly, what really, really scares me is being broke. And I've been there a few times in my life. And there is nothing more terrifying than realizing you're getting towards the end of the month. You've got bills due and you don't know where that money's coming from. Like, I've never felt fear like that in my life.
And nobody really gets into writing for the money, really. I mean,
no, no one told me that.
Okay, and my other question is, because this book is about a book club, are you in a book club, or do you have any experience with, I mean, do you like Skyping into book clubs, or what's your experience with
yeah, no, I'm not in a book club and never have been. It's just not my thing, but I've been doing, because my book came out in April, which was right as all the COVID-19 lockdown was happening. And so I've been Skyping into or Zooming into a ton of book clubs, which I really like. And I've done that in the past too with other books, and I really like it. Like, but my mom's book club, I think, is celebrating their 41st anniversary this year, which means that, like, I'm 47. So they've been around for most of my life, and I have hated them for years and years and years as a teenager.
Why?
Because to me, they were like friends' moms and these obnoxious women who would come into my house every few months and make a lot of noise, and I couldn't go downstairs. And like, you know, teenagers are judgmental. So I'd be like, ooh, the books y'all read are stupid. And like, and so really, like, getting to know them as adults and developing a lot of friendships with them and a lot of respect for them is sort of what really shaped this book. And you know, when I think for me, the first moment I stopped being an asshole was when I was kind of like, why do I have a problem with these people who've chosen to make reading and be the center of their friendship and a big part of their lives? Like, why do I have a problem with that? And I really had to look in a mirror and just be like, you're a jerk.
Yeah, as a writer, like a book club is like kind of a really cool thing.
Well, and that's one thing I've learned as a writer is like there is this like writing books aren't not enough people read, and books aren't something that get advertised often on TV. You don't see billboards. Like what really sells books is this network of actual human beings like who read together and who recommend books to each other and who know each other's tastes. Like that's what works. And that's really kind of been an amazing network to fall into. And I don't know how people do it. Like I don't know how people make the room in their lives to maintain their book clubs. And they're book clubs that are organized and gigantic. Like it's blown my mind.
So your latest book is like your first book that became a New York Times bestseller, and that happened during the pandemic. What do you attribute to that? Just because it's so awesome, or because a lot of people have time to read and they needed to escape during this?
Well, I'm uncommonly attractive, and I made sure my author photo got out there a lot, and I think that drew a lot of people to the book. But besides that, I think there are a couple of things. I think one is that this is a book that I really believe in titles. Like I think titles are so important. It's like the ad for your book is the title. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to make sure that people knew what this was about. It was vampires and book clubs. And I feel like those are two things that have a lot of fans. And I really, really think that, you know, people really wanted to read something that was a story. They didn't want to read something that made them feel crappy. They maybe wanted to read about, you know, vampires. Like I just feel like in the lockdown, people wanted to read. And, you know, I don't know, actually. I'll be honest. I really don't. I was really surprised when I hit the New York Times bestseller list because I had sort of figured like that life, like the entire universe was against me. And like I had this book that my publisher had been very down on and that suddenly people were reading and really getting enthusiastic about. And like people were really excited about it. And there was like, and now this pandemic, which I took very personally. And so I was shocked. I was really, really shocked when people were buying it and it wound up on the New York Times bestseller list.
So it's kind of like magic, really.
Yeah.
Like
and
magic happened.
Yeah. And I honestly, it's funny. It's I feel like readers really came to my rescue, you know, like book clubs I've met, librarians I've met, bookstores I've met. Like it was amazing to watch what indie bookstores did during this, to go from being brick and mortar stores that do so much walk-in business to turn on a dime to doing virtual events and mail order and curbside pickup is astounding. Mm-hmm. So it's really like this network of readers kind of came to my rescue, and I couldn't be more grateful.
Cool. So Laura, what are your questions that you have for Grady?
Okay. Well, I guess my first question was I wanted to know how you approach writing classic monsters, because you've got like vampires in this one. You riffed on like Faustian bargains in We Sold Our Souls. You did exorcism. So when you're approaching something that already has like a tremendously wide variety of different traits and characteristics that have been assigned to them, how do you decide what you want yours to be like?
You know, I don't know, I'm not very creative. And so I really like to take these tropes in horror that I've seen a million times and try to figure out what's the core of this. Like, why was this scary in the first place? You know, because I think the things that have scared us in our lives, right? You know, I'm sure people watching this, I mean, a lot of people have had some kind of unexplained encounter in their lives, and they're really shocking and they're really huge, but they're really boring. Like ghosts don't kill people. They usually just like walk across the room, or something falls off a counter, or you see something out of the corner of your eye. Like, you know what I mean? It's not like this screaming bloody apparition appears and is like, get out of my house. Like that so rarely happens. But it's so earth-shattering. I mean, maybe if this happened to someone I want to hear, they should be the one talking, not me.
Right.
And so I'm always trying to figure out what's the essence of what worked with that trope, you know? And so with my best friend's exorcism, it was like trying to figure out what would people have, that was another book like this one that had the title before I had a book. And it's like, what would people have, because exorcism stories are stories about faith, and what would people have faith in? Because I feel like religion, just people aren't as religious now as they were in the 70s when The Exorcist came out. So what would it be? And I realized it's really friendship. Like, that's, your friends are what a lot of, and especially in high school, that's what you have faith in. And with Southern Book Club, I was like, what's scary about vampires? And, you know, it's this idea of a predator, you know, and that's a serial killer to a large extent. And so I really find that a lot of fun to drill down on this stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had kind of a similar question about the horror elements that you put in. How do you know when you've got enough? Have you ever written a version of your book that you said, oh, maybe that was too far, or your editor came back and said, nope, I'm not interested in that?
You know, I've never had that happen, but I'm a really inefficient writer, so it takes me a long time to get things right. So usually there's a first draft that I'm super enthusiastic about and everyone else hates. Because it's got way too much story in it. It's like, this happens. It's like a manic child, like cornering you and like, this happened and then this happened, this, like describing a movie. And you're just like, stop, slow down. And so then I usually like really go back into it again and come up with a version that people are like, and then I come up with a third version where it's really stripped down because it's just the characters and it's me sort of going, okay, and then what? And that's usually the version that has the fewest numbers of horrific incidents, but I actually spend the time to make sure they have the impact they need to on the characters. That's like my calm draft. But you know, there's lots of things that, like in this book, I'm not going to spoil anything, but people who've read it will know, originally instead of rats, it was cats, because I find cats horrifying. And in large quantities, like a large quantity of cats is scary. And finally my editor was like, I cannot in good conscience let you put this on the market. It is too silly. Also, originally there's an attack that happens late in the book, and the book had a version where each chapter was a different point of view character. And the point of view character when that happens was the person attacked. And it was too hard. It was ugly to write. It was unpleasant to write. I got really depressed writing it. And so I changed it so that Patricia's the point of view character. So this attack is recounted to her and very little of it's described. And that's so much more effective. And like, it was just better. So yeah. And also, you know, like there's a scene in an attic in this book that a few people have an issue with. And the attic scene was really last minute. That came in like the very final stage of the book. And so like this, I'm a mess.
I had to leave the attic. I left the attic. I skipped ahead.
Yeah, I noped right out of that attic.
Yeah.
I did too. I was like, oh no, this is, and it was dark outside and everybody was asleep. So no, I left the attic.
Yeah. I've definitely done that before, where you don't realize that you get so involved in a book and you just keep reading and you think, okay, I've got to stop. And then you realize it's 3 a.m. and the whole house is dark. You're like, oh, well, I hope this goes okay.
What was that noise?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pam.
Oh, I was just gonna say, do you have like a favorite like horror film that like actually scares you? That like
Oh no, not that actually scares. I mean, my favorite horror film, and I think it's one of the two greatest movies ever made, period, full stop, is Return of the Living Dead from 1985. That's when that movie came out, I wasn't allowed to see R-rated movies. And so when that came out, a friend of mine's mom who drove carpool loved it and was taking everyone to see it but me. It's very hurtful. But that movie's so great. It just makes so many promises and then just over delivers on them. But then when I was much younger, because we would go to the video store and rent stuff because like our parents didn't know.
Mhm.
And I remember renting the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you know, I didn't know much about it. None of the actors or anyone I'd heard of. And you would rent the tapes in these sort of like plain, just clear plastic sleeves, like jackets. And the tape at the video store was a dupe that had the title written on it in magic marker. So it looked like a snuff film. And I remember watching it with my friends and we didn't like it. We were just like, but it felt really dangerous. And like, we were like, this is gross. This is dirty. I remember being very disturbed by it. And Blair Witch scared the crap out of me when I saw that in theaters when it came out.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in San Francisco, and I felt because of the camera work, it was just so like jarring that I was like, it also made me kind of physically feel ill.
Yeah.
Just, you know.
Yeah. Well, and also, you know, horror is the only genre that claims to be true, right? Like even all the way back to like Henry James' Turn to the Screw and the early Gothics, it's always like, oh, this happened to someone I know and I'm going to tell you the story. Or like Dracula is all these like fake documents that are like it really happened. Blair Witch with the mockumentary thing. You know, so much of this stuff is and so when you see something like the Blair Witch or something, these things that purport to be true and they pull it off because they come out of nowhere. You can't like Paranormal Activity, Blair Witch, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You can't do it again because now people know who you are. But those first ones, they work so well.
Yeah, Paranormal Activity really freaks me out.
Now I'm a little embarrassed at how much I liked the first one the first time I saw it, but like, because it's become this huge franchise, but I loved the first one when I saw it.
Yeah, the first one was really, I mean, because you don't really know, and then you're like, that last scene, you're like, I don't want to go to bed.
Exactly.
I have seen none of these movies because I am so easily freaked out by everything.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But wait, are you a horror like reader?
I read a little bit. So I've read your books. I have read like some Stephen King and some Michael Crichton, if he counts. I don't know if he counts as horror, but he was in junior high for sure. But yeah, it's too easy my suspension of disbelief is complete when I'm reading something or watching movies. So a lot of times I'll be in a movie or in a horror movie and then we come out of it. I was like, that was the most terrifying thing in my entire life. And my friends are like, really? It was awful. And then they start pointing out all these things. Like there was too much adrenaline. All of that, I blacked out on all of the plot holes. All I knew was fear. So I haven't seen any of these movies.
Well, wait, Laura, you're a librarian. Like, let me ask you a question because like V.C. Andrews is a writer that I really like a lot, who's like horror adjacent. Like, I think a lot of people who don't read horror, but do people still check her out? Does she still get read?
For sure.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Absolutely.
Good to know.
Yeah. Don't worry. She's still doing very well.
We have like a ton of her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Only 7 of which are written by her.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, she died in like 86, I think. So she wrote the first 7. And then a really, really good horror writer named Andrew Niederman took over as her ghostwriter.
And they don't get any credit on anywhere? No? Interesting.
Oh.
But Niederman's actually a terrific writer. I just, I prefer the original 7 V.C. Andrews books.
Yeah.
But Laura's the one who turned me on to your books because it was.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was like, my dad had died. My dad had Alzheimer's and it was a very long struggle. And I'm like, I need something fun. Like, and she recommended My Best Friends.
Oh, good. I was going to say, Southern Book Club is not the one for someone who has a relative who had Alzheimer's.
No. But I was
this was years ago.
Yeah, I was a teen in the 80s, so I totally I got it. Yep.
it was your wheelhouse. Exactly.
Yes, totally.
So I think that part of the reason why I enjoy your books so much, even though they are tremendously scary, is because there's always an emotional element to it. A lot of times with horror books or action, suspense, adventure, all these things I love, but it's real easy for them to just become kind of little plot dominoes, and then you watch the protagonist just knock them down,
Right.
and then they get to the end, you're like, oh, all right, well, that was fun, I guess. But I love that your books usually you're following the emotional arc of this main character, and it's you just watch them get the absolute snot kicked out of them until you think there's no way that they can get through this, and
Yeah.
then they get kicked in the teeth 3 more times, and then they find their way out. So
Right.
is that, how do you decide how awful you're going to be to your characters?
Well, you know,
Or
it's
do
not
you?
really a conscious choice. I mean, I guess the easy answer would be I'm an emotional sadist. But my poor wife. But no, it's not really a conscious choice. Like, this is going to sound like such a like waffle, and I don't mean it to be, but like, I just try to write books that look like what I see around me. And so like, you know, and I feel like, and it's interesting, someone else asked me that about this book, like, why do you put these characters through such horrible stuff? And I'm like, but I don't know. It just, that's what life looks like to me. Maybe I'm depressed. I don't know. Maybe I'm cynical. And, you know, it's interesting with this book because my mom, my parents got divorced when my mom was like 51, and she hadn't gone to college. Like, her family really believed that, why would you waste that money on a girl? Like, what ridiculous. They just may as well put it on fire, you know? And so she'd been a nurse for a few years, and then she got married to my dad and gave up nursing to be a housewife. And when they got divorced, she had no credit rating because she'd never had a checking account in her name. She'd never had a credit card. And,
Oh, wow.
you know, she hadn't graduated. She hadn't even gone to college. And she did this really dumb sort of like, I think a choice that some people make when they get divorced, which is like, I don't want to fight anymore. Just I'll take whatever, you know, alimony you're going to offer, which wasn't a lot. And so, and I was at home. My sisters had all graduated and gone off and were being adults. And I like hated her. We just fought all my teenage years. And she, you know, really went through the grinder. You know, she went back to college. She got her nursing certificate again. She put a life back together. And it's pretty amazing. But like, she and I were talking a while back, and she's like, I don't know how I did it. And I think that's how a lot of people are when you hit these points in your life. You don't, looking back, you're like, I don't know how that happened. Like, if someone told me this is what the next 4 years, 5 years of your life are going to be like, you'd just be like, see you later. Like, I'm done. I'm out.
2020.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I feel like, although the thing with 2020 that's been not nice, but like better, is that we're all going through it together to a large extent. And it's like, you know, like we're all in it together, which is kind of nice. Because for me, at least, and I don't know if other people do this, for the past 3 years, it hasn't felt like we're all in it together, really. And I have felt a little alienated from my like fellow Americans. So this has been a really nice reminder. Like, I'm in New York, and Monday was the first day New York City did phase 1 reopening. And part of that was construction sites were reopened. So I was walking over to my stinky little office you see here behind me, and there was a construction site on the way, and there were like 12 guys all lined up in their line, like with face masks on, everything, waiting to get their temperatures taken to go on the site. And they were so freaking happy, man. They're like dancing. Yeah. They're like air high-fiving each other. They're so excited just to be seeing each other again and to be back at work. It was kind of nice. Like, anyways. So yeah. So I just feel like that's how life happens, right? It just keeps coming and coming and coming. And then you're like, this is too much. I can't do anymore. And it keeps coming. And, you know, and that's kind of where it goes in my books. I should ease up a little, probably.
No, I think I'm always very impressed, because every time I think, oh, this is it. Like in Southern Book Club, I thought there was a point where I was like, okay, this is it for Patricia. You know, no one believes her. All of her friends have left her. Her family thinks she's crazy. And she's going to have to lay low for a couple weeks, and then then she can kind of get her act together. And then I turned the page, and the next page just said 3 years later, and I had to like set the book down and walk away for a minute. I was so upset. But then I think it
makes our questions.
Oh yeah,
somebody
well,
else had the same question.
What was,
Um,
let's see.
About that, Marilyn wants to know why have a 3-year gap before
Ah,
Patricia picks up the campaign against Harris. So you weren't alone, Laura.
yeah, no, exactly. And it's funny, when I realized I was going to do it, I was like, oh yeah, that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's such a stupid thing for an author to say. It's like, when I realize, oh, I'm so smart. But I didn't want Patricia to do this tropey kind of like 80s action movie thing where she's like gearing up, and strapping on the armor and all that. Like, I didn't, she's not that person. She's someone who's going to try to do the right thing for her kids and her family, which is to, unfortunately, the pressure is usually shut up and get in line. And one thing that was really important to me in this book was that, and not to make too big of a meal out of this, because trust me, this book is not my social message or anything, but there is a really real thing where a lot of people, I've done it myself, where things get really rough and you're like, actually, I'm in a position where I could ignore this. And you do.
Mhm.
And other people wind up suffering for it. And you have to eventually deal with the fact that you turned a blind eye on something and left other people in the lurch, and they suffered by your inaction. And I realized that just by jumping forward like that, it would just be so much more fun to write. And also all that stuff suddenly gets mashed up right there.
Yeah, I did. It made me really mad. And like the very first wave was just being so frustrated. But then the second wave was like, oh, that's perfect, because then it just takes her moral high ground right out from under her. And then she's got that to fight up
Yeah.
against too.
Well, and one of the things too is I talked to a ton of people in book clubs. Like, I mean, I talked to a lot of book clubs. And so I had a lot of people to reach out to. And one of the two things that people said, well, three things that people said over and over again, like the worst things, are people who don't read the book but insist on talking.
Yep.
People who, or especially people who don't read the book time after time after time. The other thing was people who just won't shut up. Like, clearly I don't belong in a book club because I just run at the mouth. But just people who sort of dominate the book club's dynamic by just over talking everyone. And then the third thing was people who take over the book club, like people who just start trying to run it from behind, like determining what books everyone's going to read, and sort of like, you weren't a founding member, you don't know what we're about, and now you're like running this, like now you're like telling, like someone was telling you about their book club where someone came in, and the book club had existed for 5 years before this person. And after the first 10 months they've been in the book club, they were like, well, you guys don't do very much, so I'm just going to set up some rules and things. And like, kind of wound up taking it. And the original members left. And it was like, this person carried it on. And it's like, so I kind of wanted that to happen with the book club a little bit, just because it's so awful.
I have a question. Are you a fan of true crime?
I was not. No. And in fact, true crime always kind of squicked me out, because it was like, I don't know, man, a lot of them, you look at the mass market paperbacks and the covers are a little grotty, and they've got those 8 pages of like photos in the middle. They're always crime scene
Yeah.
photos that are so gross. And like, and I really looked down on it. And the book club in the first 2 real serious drafts of this book was just a regular book club. And I had all these books lined up that I'd read. I did all this stuff. And I was like, oh my God, this would be so much more fun if there were a true crime book club. So then I had to read a ton of true crime. And I kind of, like every genre, a lot of it sucks. I mean, I'm a big horror fan, but like, it's Sturgeon's Law. 90% of everything sucks. But there's some great stuff. I mean, this is not newsflash to anyone who reads true crime, but there was great stuff that really blew me away. Like, Anne Rule is a writer I have a lot of respect for. I think just her knack for how to tell a story, her eye for these details that other people don't see, like how to sort of release information when, I mean, it kills me a little bit. I like In Cold Blood a lot, but to see how that overshadows so many other books in the true crime genre bothers me. And I really wish people would make more of a big deal out of Anne Rule's A Stranger Beside Me, because I think that's an incredible book. I mean, there's
And that's
nothing
about
else like it.
Ted Bundy, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that to me is like, Anne Rule was like a mom a single mom trying to raise 4 kids as a freelance writer for all these true detective magazines, gets her first book deal to write about what were called the co-ed murders at the time in Washington State, and doesn't even find out till later that the suspect number 1 is her good friend Ted Bundy, who works next door at a suicide hotline. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. Stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Really.
And
Yeah.
she doesn't let herself off the hook. I mean, she really she's pretty raw in that book. I'm astounded by it.
Yeah. Ted
Well,
Bundy
if
had
it
a
makes you
resurgence, because of the Netflix or whatever. There was a series
Yeah.
about
yeah,
him.
something.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. He had that movie, right? Like incredibly vile and unusually dangerous. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I watched it and
How was it?
I mean, it was all right. See, when I was a teenager, I was an oddball. I had an obsession with serial killers. I'd love to
me
read
too.
about serial killers. And then when I was in college, I wanted to be. I was a criminal justice major, and I did an internship at the San Francisco Hall of Justice. And the Night Stalker was there, and part of my and part of my job was to read the felon's mail, to make sure there. And he got a lot of mail, and that they wouldn't let me communicate with him directly, but I got to read his mail.
Was the purpose of you reading his mail to take out anything offensive, or
Yes, yep.
Was he getting fan mail?
Yeah, and oh my God, I mean, I'm a nonfiction. Well, I write nonfiction a lot, and I was going to write a book about women who get involved with inmates, with infamous inmates.
Yeah.
There's a lot of women who go after serial killers and marry them. I think Ted Bundy got married when he was in prison.
Manson did too, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very strange. Yeah. No,
you should write that book. Does it exist? I would.
There has been some books about it, but I just thought it was such an interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's it's just such a weird. Because I was like you, I was because I was a teenager in the late 80s and into the early 90s. I was in university, and there was this sort of serial killer chic in the early 90s, where I think it was after Silence of the Lambs. And they were just everywhere, and there were all the fanzines about murder and serial killers and all this, Murder Can Be Fun and all that stuff. And I loved that stuff. Yeah. And but there was this ironic edge to it. And looking back on it, I'm like, were we out of our minds? Just to have all this kind of fascination with these killers and yet be unable to name their victims, to be unable to empathize with the harm they did. I look back at myself and I'm embarrassed. I'm like, where was my empathy? But I think it's this weird thing where we all know the name Charles Manson. I mean, and I guess with the Mansons, people can name their victims because Sharon Tate was very famous,
Right.
but Jeffrey Dahmer, I can't name one of his victims. Klebold and Harris at Columbine, I can't name any of those kids they killed. It's embarrassing, which is one reason it's been so nice. Not nice. One thing I've been really, really happy to see is the whole say their names thing with police violence. Is that the people who are coming front and center and are the face of this are the victims, and that's how it should be. That is where our attention should be, is on the victims of violence, not the perpetrators. But there's something about the serial killers and public shooters that I don't get it. But I was a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was. I mean, I was because it was just so foreign and weird, and Jeffrey Dahmer, but back then when I was a teen, it was, what was his name? The guy who was the clown.
John Wayne Gacy.
Yes, John Wayne
I'm
Gacy.
embarrassed I knew that.
Fast.
You were super fast. The clown, and we knew who it was.
Actually, someone said something in the chat. Do you mind if I jump
No,
on
go
that?
for it. Go
Yeah,
for it.
no, because Jen asked, did you base these characters on people you knew or just an idea of housewives in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? And so I just want to say, everyone in my books starts out as a real person. And it might just be someone I've seen on the subway, or it might be like someone I know really well. By the time they get in the finished book, they're unrecognizable. I mean, I've had people come up to me who I know who are like, oh, wink, wink, I know who so-and-so character is based on. And they've never gotten it right once, like literally not once has anyone been able to see who someone is, even when they think they know them. But with the housewife thing, with these women in the book, I do a ton of research. And the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around for this book was parents, because I don't have kids. And so I interviewed like probably 5 or 6, I think 6 people I know, quite a bit, who have kids, just talking about it and asking them questions and stuff. And then I read a ton of housewife books. There's a lot of literary fiction that's like about housewives, and it's all horrible for the most part. Like I didn't find any I liked. It all seems to have this sort of contemptuous, sneering quality where it seems to suggest that the only valid emotions were a woman who chooses to raise her family and stay at home and not work. The only valid emotion for her is frustration and anger and disappointment in herself. And I'm like, that's not women I knew who did this. I mean, yes, that's part of their lives, but also there's so much more to it. And I also read tons of books about housewives and women working and women being in the home and all this, like tons and tons of books written in the 70s and 80s and 50s and 60s. Like, if it's raining, it must be the weekend. These sort of like sub Irma Bombeck books that were like, The Electric Woman, which is like bonkers. It's just like, there are all these weird busted ideas of what being a mom and a wife should be. And so it was really fascinating to just see kind of the messages that were going out, because my mom bought all these books, so she was always trying to get it right. And the message of the books is, you'll never get it right. You're a screw up, and your house isn't clean enough. Your children aren't smart enough. It's like, they're crazy.
And your vagina smells weird, so buy a product.
So fix it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just like this endless message of you're wrong.
Yep. Sorry, I hope I didn't offend anyone.
Oh no, trust me. I once went down a rabbit hole. I was going to write an article on the history of feminine hygiene spray, and then at the end of it, I was like, I don't want to write this article. It's
How do you feel, Susan, about that?
There was no spoiler.
Yeah.
You can say whatever you want as long as we don't do a spoiler. I'm here on the spoiler police.
Well, in the same vein is like weird products. I'd forgotten until I was writing My Best Friend's Exorcism. There used to be aisles that, I mean, I remember going in them as a kid and stuff. There used to be aisles in drugstores that were diet aids. They were basically just aisles full of speed. It was basically just aisles full of, amphetamines.
Yep.
What?
And you could buy them out of magazines. In the back of a magazine when I was in college, you just flip to, it's like, okay. And there was no call 1-800 and no cell phones. I'm from the dark ages, but you'd put your money in an envelope and send it off. So you could order a mail order.
God. It's crazy. Yeah, my sister, I have three older sisters, and 2 of them were dancers, and one was really serious about it. Man, they gobbled that stuff up. That and the Cambridge diet, which was the first really super big liquid diet. And I remember my mom like eventually banned it from the house because one of my sisters was going up to ballet lessons, and it was on the 2nd floor of a building, but it was up like a fire escape staircase, like a metal staircase. And when she had been on the Cambridge diet and was taking diet pills, and she passed out at the top of the stairs just from like lack of nutrition, and fell down the entire flight of metal stairs. And that was like the wake up call. My mom was like, okay, we're done with this. The Hendricks household has experimented with the Cambridge diet, and we are now finished with it.
Oh my gosh.
Was there anything weird out of this book that you came across, like a weird household tip that you'd never heard of while you were doing research?
Yeah, so in Peg Bracken's The I Hate to Cook book, her big household tip is vacuum your dog. She's like, I was, washing your dog's really messy and it's a pain, but I've discovered that weekly vacuuming means I have to wash my dog. I'm like, your poor dog, man.
My dog would not let that happen.
Well, they do sell an attachment. I've seen it on late night
Really?
TV, that there's an attachment that goes on and it shows somebody smiling and stroking their dog. It's like, that dog's on serious doggy value.
Yeah.
Don't say Valium on Facebook.
I was in Facebook jail for writing Valium. You can get in Facebook jail. I joked about Valium.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Got scolded, tested it twice, and was grounded. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. Valium, you don't talk about Quaaludes either, I've heard. So.
Well, you just did.
I have a question. I'm going to just jump in here on this.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for a Facebook drone to come
everybody
through
knows
your
I was the
window.
elementary reading and English language arts teacher.
You're freezing up, Susan.
Super frozen.
Oh,
Yep.
no.
I missed it.
Yep. Susan is frozen.
I'm
This is
frozen.
Facebook
Am I
Earth.
frozen?
Okay.
Y'all are frozen.
Okay, I can hear you
No,
now.
you're better.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do it.
All right. So I want to
Um,
know.
Yeah.
What did you read as a kid?
Oh, as a kid? Okay, so I didn't read horror as a kid because the covers
good.
really like grossed me out. I was very I'm very finicky. True crime grosses me out. Horror grosses me out. Like I'm such a little flower. I read a ton of science fiction, a ton of fantasy, and like terrible fantasy, like real like Lord of the Rings knockoff stuff. And Lord of the Rings was like too hard for me. I was like, this is boring. I was an idiot.
I didn't
and
like it either.
Yeah, and the thing I loved though was military fiction and like men's adventure stuff, like people with machine guns. And if it was about World War II, I was all over it. Like my dad really was a big reader. My whole family are, and my dad really believed that there's one kind of book that is actually a book, and it's hardcover nonfiction about World War II. And so like we'd go on vacation and he'd bring like 5 of these books with them, and they're all like 700 pages each and have maps, and his suitcase was like immovable. It was like lifting bricks. But I remember that was what I really loved. And in 6th grade I think 6th grade, you could finally at my school go to the upper school library to start checking out books. And I'd had my eye on a book about the 101st Airborne Squadron, the Screaming Eagles. And like first day of 6th grade, I was there checking that out, and they wouldn't let me. They thought it was inappropriate. And like my parents had to come to the school and like vouch for me. And it was really embarrassing. So yeah, I loved military fiction. And it's one thing that makes me really sad, because I have my nephews both aren't huge readers, and both of them one of them he was a big reader until about 12, and then just video games are so much cooler, like and I feel like there's not as much, like if Call of Duty had existed when I was 12, I wouldn't be a reader. Like Call of Duty's awesome. When I was 12, video games were like, here's a yellow square and that is you.
Ding, ding.
Yeah. So, and I feel like one of the things also is, I feel like a lot of boys, when you're 12, you want to read about stuff blowing up and getting shot. And there's not a lot of books like that out there right now. And I feel like that makes me a little sad. Like, it's like just to see, like, that's why I think Hunger Games did so well, is I think for boys, that was like in their wheelhouse, what they want to see when they're 12. So it makes me sad to see boys fall out of the reading habit, because it's a hard one to get back.
The book, I was looking to see if I had it up there. Guys Read.
Oh yeah, what is it? Is it like a recommendation book, or?
It's about yes, and well, it's for boys. It's written for them, in that it's its own genre of stories that are good for boys. So I have a couple of them up there in case my grandson ever gets to where he doesn't want to read. But
well, I remember
somebody
really
has seen that and attacked it.
Yeah, I remember I really loved stuff about things that felt real. Like I loved the Anarchist Cookbook. I was like, I need to learn these tips for guerrilla warfare and homemade bomb making in case the Soviets invade. My
Yep.
side of the mountain, I was like, I could be in a survival situation. I got to learn this. Like the girl who owned
What
a
about,
city.
excuse
Yeah,
me.
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, no,
What about Tuck Everlasting? Did you read Tuck Everlasting?
no.
Oh, I saw Tuck. I think you need to read Tuck.
Sure.
I read Tuck Everlasting a lot when I was reading Southern Book Club. Saw
Really?
that. There's a man in a yellow suit, and I noticed your cream suit tonight. By the way,
Oh,
you have on a
thanks.
cream suit.
Yeah.
Wasn't
He's
lost
Tuck
on me.
Everlasting.
Yeah, no, I'm writing it down.
I never thought of the Tucks when you get there. I mean, it's a quick kids read. Don't watch the
Yeah.
movie. Do not watch the movie.
Okay.
But I never thought about the Tucks being vampires because I was a chicken and I never read vampire books. I mean, my experience with horror is I saw Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween in the movie. When I was in college, I was an editor of the newspaper and I had to write a review of it. And I slept at the foot of my parents' bed for about a week because it scared me so much. I was on the floor in a sleeping bag. But anyway, I never thought about Tuck Everlasting, about them being vampires, but there was just a lot of similarity. And I think that's how I eased into your book, the vampire book.
Oh.
So
No, I'm
I was going,
definitely
oh, this
reading
is
that
going to be
now.
like Tuck. Okay.
What year is it from? Do you remember?
1975.
Really? Okay.
Natalie Babbitt
Okay.
wrote it.
No, because one of the things I did this book, Paperbacks from Hell, that was about sort of the history of the horror paperback boom in the 70s and 80s that kind of died in the mid 90s. And I wanted to do a sequel to it that was about teen fiction before Harry Potter, because someone showed me this study that was like in 1994, I think there were like 7,000 books published for teen readers, young readers.
Mhm.
And in 1999, after Harry Potter, there was something like 32,000 books published for teen readers. And I feel like before Harry Potter, books for teenagers were kind of like, they were a sleepy backwater, and people got away with a lot of weird stuff, like, and so Tuck Everlasting's right in my wheelhouse. Flowers and yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I would consider that like a young adult novel. I mean,
Well, that was
after-
marketed to adults, but yeah, I remember going to the National Boy Scout Jamboree, and we had a copy of that on the bus, passing it around for all the racy part.
I mean, I remember teens reading it. It wasn't
yeah.
like, so that's my experience with that.
Yeah,
book.
Flowers in the Attic. I'm trying to think of the other ones that always made the rounds. There were always some bodice rippers making the rounds that had really like ridiculous sex scenes in them. There was Judy Blume's Forever. What else? I can't remember the other ones, but there were those books that were like, and then Stephen King, which were like, these were all adult books, but like everyone I knew who was like 12 years old was reading them.
Carrie.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I remember reading that, and I remember watching that movie, and it was on TV with my grandmother, and it
That's
scared me,
intense.
and it scared me so bad.
Well,
And
and the
then-
crazy. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but I was young when I saw it, and now I watch it, and it's like a totally different experience. But just that hand coming up out of
Yeah.
the ground, that just like, oh my gosh, that's
Well, it's also weird because Carrie is I find it a really scary movie. And I remember seeing it as a teenager and being a little freaked out by it. But it's interesting because like, I don't walk around going, oh my goodness, I'm really scared of psychic teenagers who don't know about their menstrual cycle. Like it's and I feel like the thing with Carrie except for that great jump scare at the end, the thing about Carrie that's so scary is it's just full of these really resonant, horrifying images. Like her with the blood all over herself with her eyes, like her on the floor of that shower saying, help me, help me. Just like and that sort of gothic claustrophobic house she lives in. That's what I realized, like the stuff that bugged me about that movie, not that I'm scared of psychic teenagers.
I was scared of her mother. Her mother was the scary
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah.
Carrie. I was like, you go, girl.
Yeah.
They deserve it. but Carrie's mom was scary. She was, I mean, I don't even know why they remade that movie, because of the original is just so.
They've remade it a couple of times, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
I know they made it about 4 years ago. I saw it. I went to see it.
They made a sequel. That's what it was. They've made a couple of sequels, a made for TV sequel and a theatrical sequel.
Yeah. I don't think it's necessary, but I won't go there. Laura, do you have any questions?
I mean, sure. Let's see, where's my list? Oh, I was going to ask, since this is a quarantine book club kind of formed around debut authors, and I know there are a ton of debut authors in the book club who have had their debut kind of pulled out from under them because of the quarantine. What can you talk about your debut author experience? Do you remember what that was like, having your first book on the shelf?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd co-written a cookbook with my wife, who's a chef, and I wrote a couple of YA books with a really good friend of mine from high school. And those were fine. They were into, but they, that was more me helping someone else or working with someone else and sort of their vision and stuff. And so Horror Store was my first like big boy book. And I'd self-published a few things. And it was so much fun to do because I was working with Quirk, which is a smaller publisher, but they let me be super involved with the design. Like Andy Reid was a designer on it. And like, there was just so much, like my editor was like, okay, it's going to look like an IKEA catalog. It's about a haunted IKEA. And it's going to have the trim size of an IKEA catalog. And then Andy would be like, well, we could put in pictures of furniture at the front of every, chapter. And then I'd be like, well, because I've written catalog copy before being a freelancer. I was like, well, then it has to have catalog copy. And then like, someone was like, well, what if it got turned into torture device? So it's like, we were able to kick around all this stuff and really like, everyone just kept making it better. And that was so much fun because publishing isn't always like that, especially at a really big house. And, but I remember my first bookstore event and, they were like, okay, we set up this bookstore event. This is great. So I was a little outside Philadelphia. So I like rented a car. I drove and drove and drove. I was like 2.5 hours away from New York. And I'm like on these these roads going through like, that sort of part of Pennsylvania. It's like 2 lanes and it's like, and I get to this bookstore and there was like one person sitting in the 30 chairs they have set up. And I'm like, okay, that's cool, man. They came out and I'm just going to rap with them. It's just going to be me and them. They're going to have the best experience. And I go over and I'm like, hey, are you here? And she's like, oh, I'm just waiting for my friend. They're in the back browsing. I'm like, hey. And she's like, please don't talk to me. I'm like, okay. And they made the store. The chairs. Yeah, exactly. And they made the store employees sit down to listen to me talk. And the register was behind me. So every time someone needed help, they would have to get up and go behind me. And it was miserable, and probably more miserable for them than it was for me. And so now I do like a full show. When I do an event, I do a show. It's like a 1-hour show. I sing, I do all kinds of dumb stuff. I usually have it offsite in a bar more often than not. Like I'll get a library or bookstore to sponsor it at a bar because I will never do that again. I can't. People want to have a good time. They want to party. They don't want to leave their house and get lectured by me. Listen to this voice. It's like a dentist drill. And so I just like, I want people to have fun. And part of doing the show is if people understand that I'm the biggest idiot in the room, they're all going to relax and like let their hair down and have fun. So that's one thing I really like. For me as a writer, I love going out and meeting people. I love doing bookstore things. I really like Skyping in and doing Zoom with book clubs is a little hard because it's hard. You don't feel like you're meeting people as much as you do in person, which is, I don't like. But it's really nice to see people and see their faces and do all that. I like that. I feel like my job is to be an entertainer, like I want people to have a good time. Like they read my book. I'm grateful.
Yeah. I mean, it is a different experience. And I have had a book event that was very similar to that in New Orleans. Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
so sad. I'm like, I'm never going back to New Orleans ever again.
That whole town is
Elizabeth.
dead to me.
Elizabeth just said she used to manage a retail bookstore, and author events were 99% awful. That's what
Yeah.
yeah, Elizabeth. we agree.
One of the reasons I think people have liked doing the Zoom events, because I've seen there's a lot of attendance at them, is if you get bored, you don't have to do the whole pardon me, excuse me, pardon me thing, and everyone looks at you and the author stops reading and gives you like murder eyes, like just bink, and you're out. Like no one even knows you're gone. You know, it's kind of nice.
Yeah. I have to go do my taxes. I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
We have a
Oh,
question.
someone wants to.
Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Someone wants to know: could there be, or is there going to be a sequel?
So I don't do sequels really, just because there's so many books I've got ahead that I really want to write. Like I know what my next 4 books are, and 2 of them are already under contract. Actually, I know what my next 5 are, and 3 are under contract. So like, I got a lot to do. I'm not getting younger.
I don't have time to do it again.
So was this book option for film or TV?
Yeah. So for TV, and that is, so when I said there were 2 other versions of this book before I got to the version that I refined into way, like those are full novels that are radically different. So one of the nice things about the TV show, and I've already talked to the producers and stuff, is that they're going to use a lot of that material for the show. And one of the things I'm really glad they're going to do is Ms. Green is going to have a much bigger part in it. Because, you know, it's an African-American woman, you know, and like, they're like, we can get a really good actor for this. Like, and there's just not as many of these parts as there should be. So they're really excited about that. But the other thing is, I wouldn't be comfortable writing her a bigger part in the book. But when I was growing up, you know, a lot of people had help who worked in their houses. I mean, it was South Carolina in the 80s and the early 90s. And the women, they were African-American for the most part. They were home health care attendants. They took care of the kids. They were cleaners. And they were, you know, they were really people who were a part of the family. And I don't mean that in a diminishing way, but like you saw them every day. They became intimately acquainted with how your family worked, and you became intimately acquainted with how their family worked. And there were lots of issues of race and class and all that stuff, and money, all that, all in there. But they were a part of the structure of your house. And one of the things that I always thought was really interesting that's not in the book is a lot of times in the mornings, moms would check in on each other. You'd call so-and-so, you drop by such and such's house, you do whatever. And a lot of these African-American women who worked in these homes would do the same thing. They would, oh, I've got to go to so-and-so's house to pick something up, or I need to go return this to such and such. And they would use that as a moment where they would all wind up at the same house to a large extent and have a cup of coffee. And I'm like, oh my God, their view of those families and those neighborhoods, it was like the flip side of the coin. And it was fascinating. And so for the show, they want to use that. They want to have that be a part, and they're going to have writers of color in the writer's room and stuff, and really show both sides of that world, which I think is great. I really am excited.
Are you going to work on the script on that, or no, you're done?
Probably not. Like, they haven't gotten to the point where that's happening. I'll be a producer and I'll be involved in that way. And they obviously want stuff from me. Like, some of the ideas I've given them, they're already incorporating into building this out. But like, I won't be in the writer's room. I write books. That's how I make my living. And I did my first writer's room for a Netflix show earlier this year, and they're fascinating. But that is such a different, like, I've never sat in a room with a bunch of other writers all working on the same project, and it was like the most educational thing I've ever experienced. It's such a different skill set. It's such a fascinating process. It's amazing. But it's also like, I sit in this stinky room by myself and write books. That's so different from knowing how to make a really efficient writer's room that writes shows. It's just a different animal. Yeah.
Our featured author of the day is Gina Fitori, who is, she wrote for the Gilmore Girls.
Oh, okay.
But she wrote her first novel that just came out during the pandemic. And so I mean, I would love to write in TV, but I live in Texas, and that's not
Yeah.
that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard thing about TV is like you've got to be where they make TV.
Yep.
Like it
Mhm.
stinks. Although Texas is doing a lot more production these days.
Yeah, but not on the same level. I mean, we're really the production is in Oklahoma. Norman?
Really?
Really?
Yeah,
Why
There-
Oklahoma?
probably because it's cheap to film there.
It's cheap.
Oh, cheaper than
No
Texas,
rules.
really?
Yep.
Wow.
Have you been to Oklahoma?
Once, very briefly. Wow,
I
that is
own
some
land in
shade.
We have a place in Oklahoma.
Well, that's like, yeah, it sounds like y'all are about Oklahoma the way like everyone in South Carolina is about Georgia. Like even my mom, who's like this, she will not say a bad thing about anyone. You bring up Georgia and she's like, well, bless their hearts. They're trying hard.
Oh, that's it. That's bless. Yep.
Bless their
mhm.
heart.
She called me actually. There was a thing about a guy who had passed away. He was like 97 years old or something, and he was this much beloved person in a town in Georgia who was a janitor, which great, you know, everyone knew it. And my mom called me to say, a famous janitor. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Only in Georgia. I was like, where? Like it really brings out her claws. I don't know what Georgia did to her. I was like, I'm sure this was a lovely guy who had a meaningful life. She's like, well, I'm sure you'd like to think so.
Was he a school janitor, a school custodian?
I think so. Yeah. No, a church.
Oh,
Oh,
Okay.
school
Yeah.
custodians are elevated. School custodians are.
okay.
Oh,
We
yeah.
have one question, and then we got to wrap this up.
Okay.
Linda wrote, I loved all of the book titles you mentioned in the book. Did you read all of those books, and which one was your favorite?
Oh yeah, I read them all. I used to be a working journalist, like doing like cultural coverage. And I got in trouble not in trouble. I got mad at myself once because I wrote about something where I didn't know enough. And so I have a rule that like I read everything cover to cover and watch it all start to finish if I'm talking about it. So yeah, I read them all. And so the books that were the weirdest to read was I read a lot of the big 90s nonfiction titles that were like the books of the decade, like, you know, Running with Wolves and Iron John and Listening to Prozac and The Erotic Silence of the American Wife. And God, what were the other ones? I've got some of them sitting around here. I can't remember. But the weirdest one of that bunch was, well, there's two stories. One is I actually worked in a bookstore in my hometown when I was in university, and I would come back in the summers and work in a bookstore. And growing up, I always had this nightmare that like if I bought a book or checked out a book from the library, the librarians or the people who worked there would be like making fun of me after I left for what I was reading. I was always really self-conscious.
Oh,
my
we
mom
do.
Yeah, I know. Well, my mom was all like, no one does that. You know, you're not that important to them. So I was like, oh, okay. And then when I worked in a bookstore, it's all you do. And there was this book called The Erotic Silence of the American Wife that came out in the early 90s. It was all about how all these women who this woman did this study of, you know, all fantasized about leaving their husbands, and like many of them did, and it was the best thing they ever did. And I remember when that book was on the market, we'd see people, like people's moms I knew would come into the bookstore and they'd browse and they'd browse and they'd browse, and we knew they weren't really browsing, it was a smoke screen. And then they grab Erotic Silence and like 7 other books and just like,
Yeah.
and as soon as they left, we'd all be like, But the other one that blew my mind rereading it though was listening to Prozac, because listen, I have nothing against pharmaceuticals. I have people in my life who they have turned their lives around, but listening to Prozac is a weird book because it's written by a psychiatrist who is prescribing it to his patients. And the thesis of the book is everyone should take Prozac. You should take it more. We don't know how it works. We don't really know what the side effects are. We're not sure in what situations is more or less effective, but take it. Even if you don't feel like you need it, it's going to make you a better person. You're just going to be better. You know, my patients come in and they try to tell me all that blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, here, before we get it, just take some Prozac. And they are so much more engaging and fascinating to talk to after that. This book is crazy. It is crazy.
Oh, So that book is going to be checked out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have that at the library, Laura? We'll have to check that.
I don't know off the top of my head. I can find out
You
tomorrow.
will see.
Yeah. Yeah. It was when 50 Shades was really popular. That was the one that people are like,
Oh,
"No."
still
Oh,
people
yeah.
will come up to the desk and they say, "Excuse me, do you have 50 Shades of Grey?" Like, I'm sorry, what? I'm looking for 50 Shades of Grey. Like, I can't hear you. And I was like, "Oh, 50 Shades of Grey." Like, you don't have to be embarrassed. We have 12 copies of it.
Yeah.
Like, you're not alone. Everyone's reading it.
But wear
I rem-
gloves when you do, because
I remember when that book was out, I was on a plane and I was sitting in a window seat, and there was this like middle-aged like church lady in the center seat, hat, everything. And the plane takes off and she pulls out 50 Shades of Grey and starts reading it. And I'm like, well, good for her. And I fall asleep and I wake up halfway through the flight because I want my free biscotti. And she is weeping, like weeping tears as she's reading. And I was like, okay, she is going through some stuff that I do not understand. I'm like, go back to sleep, go back to sleep. Give her her privacy, because this book is her book. Like, she doesn't want a bystander right now.
No.
and on that note, I think we're going to close.
Right.
I don't know if that book has made anyone else cry, but
But if it made one person cry, that's enough.
Yeah. I mean, that was her, that book was talking her language, you know?
Yeah.
you hear that, E.L. James, your book makes people
Yeah.
cry. So thank you so much, Grady, for joining
Oh,
us.
dude, thanks for having me.
It was fun. This was
Yeah.
really fun. Laura, Susan, Amy, and Nancy, thank you to you all for helping. Couldn't do this by myself. And happy Wednesday.
Yeah. Happy Wednesday.
Thank you all so much. I couldn't be more
Yeah.
grateful. Bye.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.